It's my pleasure to welcome you to an event that is being sponsored by the Dartmouth Centers Forum. The Dartmouth Centers Forum was founded in 2005 by 6 centers: the Dartmouth Center for the Advancement of Learning, the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, the Ethics Institute, the Fannie and Alan Leslie Center for the Humanities, the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences, and the William Jewett Tucker Foundation, as a collaborative alliance to promote an open, campus-wide dialogue on complex issues. The forum has grown to include the Dartmouth Institute for Security Studies and the Alwyn Initiative for Corporate Responsibility. The Centers Forum works collaboratively on a specific theme for each academic year, and this year the theme is religion and politics. We chose that theme because the world is witnessing an explosion in religious observance and spiritual curiosity. What does this phenomenon mean for civil society? How are we to balance tolerance with ethical absolutes? And does this trend show any signs of slowing or increasing? We're extremely fortunate to have with us today 2 of the leading journalists working in the field. David VanBiema is the senior religion writer at Time magazine, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, coincidentally, this week's Time magazine, the cover story is David's story on Opus Dei. Great story, by the way, you should pick it up. David was hired as an associate editor at Time in 1993. Previously, he held writing positions at Life, People, and the Washington Post Sunday magazine. Mr. VanBiema graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Wesleyan University and holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Philippe Gelie is the U.S. bureau chief for Le Figaro, one of the leading French morning daily newspapers. He is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Mr. Gelie has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master in law from the University of Bordeaux. We've asked Mr. Gelie and VanBiema to each present approximately 15 minutes of commentary, and the primary point of this afternoon's session is to really have dialogue with you about some of the issues that you think are important within this topic of religion and politics. And with that, I'll turn it over to David VanBiema.
Hi. Let me see, I guess I don't need the glasses if I do this. Can you hear me? If I talk semi-loudly? No. Oh, I see. Sure, I'll turn the one I'm wearing on. We'll see how that works. After all. Rather than the traditional joke, I thought I'd lead off with a prayer that I used to say every day when I was young. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And now I'll stop because I stopped back then too. I grew up in the town of Tenafly, New Jersey, and I'm 50 years old. And every morning, along with the Pledge of Allegiance, we said the Lord's Prayer. And I suppose that the prayer in itself could be deemed acceptable to any of the 3 great monotheisms. But in retrospect, the title should have been problematic to me, since the Lord to whom it refers is not the God being prayed to, but the person who is doing the praying in the Gospels, which is to say Jesus Christ, who is not my Lord. As a six-year-old non-religious Jew, I didn't know any better, and my parents didn't complain. That was my little slice of the civic religion that you hear so much about, a kind of a watered-down Protestantism that had become the accepted vehicle for religious interaction, or really for religious non-interaction, that was assumed by everybody, but discussed openly as seldom as possible. It was an attitude summed up neatly by Dwight Eisenhower, who said, "Our form of government has no sense unless it is grounded on deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." Which was the way it was. But things changed. And in 1963, as you all know, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against prayer in the public schools. And you might think, and you might say, and you might be correct, that worked to my advantage. But it was not the last word, or if you want to put it another way, it wasn't the last silence. Although it stifled a public expression of religion, in doing so, along with some other dynamics that were going on in American culture, it began a chain of unintended consequences that have changed our national discourse. Practically speaking, it provoked increased political activism on the part of American conservative Christians. Even more broadly, it helped shape a new religious conversation, where religious particularism, I'm a Jew, I'm a Southern Baptist, I'm a traditionalist Catholic or more of a Vatican II Catholic, far from being suppressed, became Thanksgiving table conversation, subcommittee conversation, electoral conversation, and that new boldness extended, it seemed, to everybody, and one of the results was a big controversy in my hometown, which I was away for. I had already graduated, but I had sort of an interest from afar. In the year 2000, a group of Orthodox Jews set up what is called an eruv, an area defined by boundaries, in this case telephone wires, around about a third of Tenafly. And an eruv makes certain kinds of Orthodox Jewish communities possible because it sidesteps a prohibition against carrying things on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. It allows women and old people to come to synagogues in a wheelchair or with a baby carriage. It allows everybody to kind of do the same thing, carrying something in their pocket, which they might not normally be able to do. And it really enables religious and social intercourse. It enables community. It had the potential of enabling lots of Orthodox Jews to move into my town who hadn't been there. The Tenafly Eruv Association appears to have gotten permission from the county to sacralize some of its telephone wires and run a small wire down the telephone poles to indicate that they had ritual status, that the wires had ritual status. But the borough itself tried to order the association to take down what it had put up. And very briefly, the argument for the Eruv was essentially, well, why not? It helped Orthodox Jews live in Tenafly, and who is it hurting? And then there were various arguments that were made against it, that it was an intrusion of religion into public space. More importantly to my father, who still lived in Tenafly at the time and who had been very involved in its school system, that it would attract an Orthodox population that would not send its children to the public schools, that would send them to Jewish day schools. And the public schools were, in many ways, Tenafly's calling card, so that was no small matter. So in contrast to the sort of placid understanding of the 1950s and the very early 60s, by the 1980s, 90s, and aughts, people stood on their religious differences, and the Eruv Party ended up taking the borough to court. And despite the complaints that you hear from the religious right about all the liberal judges, even in 2001, one legal expert warned the borough of Tenafly to settle on practical grounds. He said, with many sitting federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, there's been greater leeway given to groups that want to establish a religious presence than in the past. And Tenafly learned the hard way that he was right. And only last January, this is like 6 years, only last January, after 6 years and a journey up to the Supreme Court where the town was denied a hearing, denied certiorari, Tenafly finally gave in and allowed the Eruv to stand and paid the Eruvniks $325,000 of court costs. So it was really a significant hit, and it was not a nice situation. Nasty things were said on both sides. So the question is, which Tenafly do I prefer? Well, as a Jew, I guess I'm happy that they stopped me praying the Lord's Prayer. But I like the schools themselves, and I'm dismayed at the the possibility that a sizable part of the civic body might opt out of them. And I was dismayed as I made my way through the clips regarding the Tenafly Eruv battle recently, which I might add was more between Jew and Jew than it was between Jew and Gentile. That included intimations on the one side that some Orthodox Jews would throw stones at people for not observing the Sabbath, and then counter intimations that the real problem that some of the opponents had with the Eruv was that they were scared of their own Jewish identity. And I found myself wishing that there might have been some civilized way to work it out. And I'm coming around to the realization that I'm a product of my age, that among other things, I want a more honest religious discussion than was available in the Eisenhower era, but somehow I want that discussion to occur in calm Eisenhower era tones. And whether that's possible or not is anybody's guess, and I guess that's what I'm here briefly to. I mean, it's a huge introduction with very little to show for it. But is anybody's guess. It seems to me that surveying the development of the national conversation since I began writing Religion for Time, that although we may be moving toward developing a more nuanced and less caricatured understanding of one another's positions on faith, that real disagreements and the mechanism of the political process may trap us in tired reiteration of the culture wars for the near future. If you don't mind, I'm going to shift from Jews to evangelicals, because I've been writing more about evangelicals than I have been writing about Jews, and talk about them for a little bit, say and use them sort of as a case study. On the upside, from my point of view, evangelicals have always known that they were much more diverse than the mainstream press made them out to be. So they were never quite as simplistic as we have sometimes suggested. But I would also say that not only is the press catching up, but conservative Christians finally given a chance over the last 40 years to return from the sidetrack that they had sort of been on since the Scopes trials, to back into the powerful center of American life, are understanding themselves in a more sophisticated way. And here are a couple of data points. Last February, the National Association of Evangelicals came like this close to adopting a green platform, an environmental platform, an anti-global warming platform, and actually at the very precipice, they kind of pulled back because there's some very powerful Christian conservative figures in Washington said, don't do it, and they didn't do it. But an alternative group popped up, a green evangelical group popped up with a list of real evangelical players like Rick Warren and the Salvation Army's national commander. And they signed an alternative statement, and this looks like something that's a real discussion that's going on, and it looks like a real diversity within that subculture. And Warren himself I find very interesting. He has steadfastly refused. He's this guy who has this megachurch out. He wrote The Purpose-Driven Life, which has sold a gazillion books, and he has this megachurch called Saddleback in Orange County, and he's really a very influential guy, for those of you who don't know him far better than I do. He's refused steadfastly to make issues of the religious right his preferred issues. He stands out in especially high relief because he's listened to other conservative Christians who are much more economically liberal, like Ron Sider, and addressed himself to all the many, many lines and verses in the Bible about poverty. And Warren's his concentration on AIDS, and his willingness to make common cause with AIDS activists, again, I find heartening, reaching out beyond what other people perceive to be your normal boundaries. And lastly, before I finish up with the evangelicals, there was an essay online on Christianity Today. I just kind of did a lot of the work on this last week, and so I was being opportunistic, which Christianity Today kind of occupies an educated center position in evangelicalism, which read in part, I do not know how or whether the cultural war can be won. Human culture, like human nature, is too incorrigible, too intractable for unambiguous victories. I suggest we have consigned our armies to a conflict that is unwinnable by definition, and by making disciples into warriors, we have risked robbing them of the high calling, that is the new birthright of every Christian, to be an agent of improbable, impossible life in the midst of the world. Now, this is always a theme in evangelical thought. There's a desire to withdraw from the battles over what is basically a fallen human system, a fallen humanity and a fallen human political system, in favor of personal salvation and evangelization for that. But interestingly, the last wave of that we saw really happened during the Clinton years, when the religious right was sort of on the defensive. To hear that kind of language now, when the religious right is still riding pretty high, I find that to be heartening, just because of the humility. I'm not asking everybody. I mean, I think I lost the line that I had about that, but it's something along the lines of my personal politics are such that I'm very comfortable with the evangelicals pulling back a little bit. But in fact, beyond that, I think that humility is called for, and the ability to talk to other people is always called for. Oh yeah, here's the paragraph. I'll forget it. Okay, but here comes the downside. And the downside is I don't really think that voices such as these will define the tone of the discussion for the near future, as much as I might wish that they would. It's not as though the only thing standing between conservative Christians and secular liberals is the style of rhetoric. There are real issues, like abortion, like gay marriage. Rick Warren may not choose to concentrate on them, but the voters, perhaps to a greater extent, and perhaps to a greater extent the political parties have, and they do. And so recently we have a front page article in the New York Times by David Kirkpatrick that talks about a new petition in favor of a federal amendment blocking same-sex marriage, signed by 50 prominent religious leaders, including 7 Roman Catholic cardinals and half a dozen archbishops. And Kirkpatrick notes that 51% of the public opposed legalizing same-sex marriage, down from 63% in February 2004, which should make it less of an issue. Now it's me, not Kirkpatrick, talking. But he also pointed out that the drive's organizers saw it as a useful effort to, quote, revive the groundswell of opposition to same-sex marriage that helped bring many conservative voters to the polls in some pivotal states in 2004, close quote. At a time when Republican strategists are worried that the Iraq war and gas prices may dampen conservative enthusiasm. And I believe the amendment is to be introduced in June, just in time for people to get a few good months of thinking about it in before they go to the polls. That's a fairly deadly combination of a bone that still needs to be picked and a political will to pick that bone. Even the 51% who polled against gay marriage still makes up half of the evangelical electorate, presumably. Excuse me, yeah, right, and the active involvement, yeah, I'm sure that number's wrong, but in any case, it's a very high number. And the active involvement of the Catholic bishops means that in religious institutional terms, the issue is still picking up real momentum, not just sort of manufactured momentum, but real momentum. Gay marriage as a voter mobilization tool will be revived by the left, I might add, as well as the right. I've just been talking about evangelicals because I write about them, but doesn't mean that you couldn't say the same things about the left. They do direct mail also. It will go on beyond what the debate's natural lifetime really should be, whatever that is. We're stuck with it. It's an issue. And it's an issue that has been framed in explicitly religious terms. And there are others. We could talk about a full-bore abortion case that could come before the court, maybe the ban in South Dakota. Georgia's decision we could talk about to offer government-sanctioned courses on the Bible with the Bible as a textbook. We could talk about everything, all kinds of stuff. There's just dozens and dozens and dozens of things, and some of them are bull. Some of them are manufactured, but some of them really do go to where people live. So I have no expectation that Christian conservatives will be subsumed by conservative Christianity. That is, that the political aspect will sort of disappear into religious understanding, at least on the national stage. Or for that matter, that liberals who had the upper hand for decades will be any more likely to give up on any of those points. And I had an example on that, but I'm going to skip it because I feel like I'm talking too much. But basically, I fear that the country is a lot closer to Tenafly in 2006 than to the sort of rigged placidity of my childhood memories. And it'll be a while before we find an equilibrium, and I am left, as the Apostle Paul said of my ancestor Abraham, hoping against hope. A couple of days ago, I saw a précis of an AP article noting that, however my colleague can correct me, noting that 56 pastors and organizational leaders, some from the conservative Southern Baptist Convention, had called on their brother and sister Baptists to speak positively about public education in response to what seems like an upcoming conservative movement to pull Baptist children out of the schools. And that brought me back again to Tenafly's Erev. As I mentioned, of the arguments against the Erev, I think the one that my dad found most persuasive and the one that bothers me the most was that the Orthodox population wouldn't send its kids to the schools that I went to. And that's not to say that I don't think that day school is a foundational building block of Orthodox Jewish training. It doesn't seem right to root against it. But at the same time, the Lord's Prayer or no Lord's Prayer, I would like to think that I and my fellow graduates who emerged from Tenafly High School with a common language in which to argue with one another. And so I hope that the 56 pastors are persuasive. I'm not sure how far religious particularism needs to go in order to even out the inequities of a national discussion that went on so one-sidedly for so long. But if it goes so far that we eliminate our common intellectual language, then we may not even recognize the opportunity if by some chance we find a point on which to agree.
You use both, right? The mics. Well, I'm going to ask for your forgiveness because I won't recite the prayer, not because I don't know them, but because I wouldn't be able to translate them properly in English. Instead, I thought that I would try to bring some European perspective on those issues of religion and church and state. And let's start with the principle. It's always amazing to see how similar the principle can be, and for a very different result, sometimes opposite. Let me read you the preamble of the French Constitution. France is a republic united, secular, and indivisible. It guarantees equality before the law for all citizens, regardless their origin, race, or religion. It respects all beliefs. It's strikingly similar to the American Constitution, right? But the result of this principle for us is the opposite. We have instituted separation of church and state to protect the state from the church, not the other way around. And I think in the United States it's much more to protect the church from the state. Obviously that comes from the European history. You all know that we have had periods in Europe when religion was in power, and a lot of bad things, a lot of evil came out of that, from the Crusades to the Inquisition to war of religions, and so on. And this is something that is still very present in our minds. It is something that we are taught at school. This is something every European knows, that when an absolute truth like faith is in power, it can become quickly very dangerous. And that may explain some differences between the two sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, most countries are less secular than the United States. Only one country in Europe has this principle of separation of church and state enshrined in its constitution, and that's France. You have 6 countries with a state religion. I have written down there: Denmark, Finland, Norway, Greece, Orthodox Church, UK, Anglican Church, and Malta, Catholic Church. You have 8 countries that practice separation of church and state, but that don't have put it in their constitution. Those are Hungary, Latvia, Portugal, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden, and France again. And we have 15 countries where there is what we call a concordat. Concordat is a kind of preferential deal between the church. When I say the church, most of the times in France, it's the Roman Catholic Church, of course, Rome. So you have a special deal between the state and Rome, by which the church has some benefits and advantages. You find that in Austria, Spain, Italy, Germany, Poland, and in this list are the most religious European countries today. So they don't have a state religion. They are in between with this type of concordat, this kind of deal. But the the state of principles is one thing, the practice is something else. So in some countries, and especially in France, what we see now, and what we've seen for the last half century, I would say, is a sort of desertification of religion. Let me give you a few figures. In 1965, 96% of the French population declared themselves Catholics, and 45% went to church once a week. In 2001, 69% of the French population still considered themselves as Catholics, but 9% went to church regularly, which by that time had become once a month. So even Christmas is a religious celebration for only 41% of the population in France. For the others, it's a family gathering. The number of priests in France, we had 41,000 priests in 1965. We are under 20,000 now, and that means that around 9,000 parishes don't have a priest in France. And France is a small country, as you know. So. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that, that religion has disappeared, not at all. At the same time, you find now, the last figure I got was 600,000 secular people taking over a lot of missions and tasks in parishes and in churches, and probably the people who worship today are more convinced than the global population might have been before. More involved, at least. And religion still plays a role in politics, but in a very different way, I think, than in the United States. What I call invocation of God. That doesn't exist. That's over. Don't do it if you want to be elected in Europe. Don't bless your listeners. Don't invoke God, and don't mix God with politics in a way that might have your voters think that it could influence your decisions. That it has to be. It's true in France, but it's not only true in France. It has to be separated. That doesn't mean that the church or the religions in general don't try to influence policies. Of course, they try to. But the decision, when it is taken, even on an issue like gay marriage, for instance, the church has an opinion. Most religions have an opinion about that. They will express their opinion, but it will probably be taken into account. But at the time when it is decided, it will be decided probably on the advice of a panel where you would find religious people, specialist experts in the realm of the judiciary, the civil law, marriage institutions, social structure of the country, and so on. And that's how, for instance, the decision was taken in France and in other countries in Europe on abortion. This is not. We feel that this is not a decision you can let to religious people or clerics, because it will never be taken, because they want everything, and it's a nothing or all attitude. So, for instance, abortion has been granted to the French in 1974, almost like in the US, but never in an unlimited way. There always has been limits and conditions, the number of weeks, the permissions of the parents, and when you are under 16, all sorts of permissions, of conditions, if you want. And I think even the most liberal of the French would be surprised to see that in the US, the American society, in a way, failed to find a common ground on this, and so the result is a little bit awkward, because you have people very much opposed to it, you have people in favor of it, and the law, there is no law. It's a decision of the Supreme Court, and it's hard to impose limits on the practice. Religion plays a role in Europe also on the vote, on the way people vote. They tend to vote more on the right. The more religious they are, the more they vote on the right. And surprisingly, the more they vote in favor of Europe, in favor of supranationality. You know, it's a big issue. You know, the French have defeated the constitution and the last referendum last year. But if you look at the map, people who tend to worship and to belong to the Catholic religion tend to favor Europe. The religion tries to interfere in political matters in many countries. There has been a fight last year in Denmark because the Protestant Church had advised its followers to vote in favor of the party who would treat well the immigrants, and also of the parties in favor of the parties who would act in favor of withdrawing the troops from Iraq. You have a big fight now in Spain around the issue of gay marriage, with the church trying to press on the issue. You have, we have had in France, of course, the issue of the Islamic scarf, which was a big national debate. But you cannot say it's a debate that was provoked by Muslim scholars or clerics. No, it was a reaction of the secular French Republic in front of a phenomenon that they could not manage. The fact that young girls were going to school with an Islamic scarf, and on the basis of their religion would refuse to participate to gym classes, for instance, would refuse the medical exam at the beginning of the year, all sorts of things. And that's where the French Parliament thought that they would have to intervene. And what they did, I don't think it's, personally, I don't think it's a good law. I think it's a bad law. But they decided that they would forbid any provocative sign of belonging to any religion. So if you have a small cross on your shirt, it's fine. But if you have a big cross in front of, on top of your sweater, that doesn't work. You cannot enter school. The same with a kippah, the same with a scarf. So we have this secular school, which is effectively banning religion. It has to stay outside. If you want to wear a scarf in France, you can go to a religious school. There are some Muslim schools, more, obviously, many more Christian schools. But that's the rationale, if you want, behind this law. Maybe you will have some questions about that. What we don't have also anymore, because probably in ancient times we had it, we don't have this sort of messianism that one can see sometimes in the United States. This kind of secular religion by which a country can see itself as invested of a mission, a human mission, but also universal, almost deistic mission to bring the good to other nations. We have abandoned that a long time ago. Maybe we can discuss that later on. Basically, one of the big differences I see as a foreigner is that it's much easier in the United States to be somebody, a worshipper, to be somebody religious, and to be tolerant at the same time. Why? My analysis is that it's easier to be tolerant or not to try to be dominant with others when you have many religions. Not one here is in a position to impose anything to others. And as long as it works this way, I think you have a big advantage compared to us. Europe is essentially a Catholic, a Christian continent, dominantly Catholic. And there is a last thing I wanted to say. Just one thing about Messianism. One of the consequences of this Messianism, this is a figure that was published by the Pew Research Center, and it was a poll conducted last year after the 2004 election. The assertion is, best way to ensure peace is through military strength. 72% of the white evangelical Protestants in the United States think it's right. You have to go to the Jews, 49%, or the seculars, 44%, to find a minority. I'm definitely sure in Europe it would be the exact opposite. A tiny minority would think that military strength is the best way to bring peace throughout the world. And let me finish on this. You may have heard of a French trendy philosopher who used to be called nouveau philosophe. New philosopher is no longer new anymore, but anymore. He published a book called American Vertigo, and it's a bit pretentious to argue that you would follow the footsteps of Tocqueville. But there are some amusing insights in those. And about religion, at some point I wondered, do we have the same God? And he asked the same question. His answer is this. He's stricken by the power of a religion whose secret is, perhaps, simply to get rid of the distance, the transcendence, the remoteness of the divine that are at heart of European theologies. A present God this time, a God who is there, behind the door or the curtain, and asks only to show himself. A God without mystery, a good guy God, almost a human being, a good American, someone who loves you one by one. I end there. Thank you.
I apologize. I should have mentioned before the talk started that these comments are not on the record. We have two journalists who have... Yours are. Philippe, David's are done. Because of his age. I don't know why. Yeah. So I just put that out as a reminder to you. We'd like to open it up at this point to questions or comments. We've heard a national perspective and then an international perspective in the rise of religion. And we open it up to your questions or comments. Yes. Nice and loud if you would, since we're taping. So.
I have a question for the French government. When the French passed their policy for eradicating religious symbols in the country, I was back home in Pakistan. And there was this big, this was ruckus in Pakistan about obviously the religious riots that happened. So my question is that, I mean, France is a secular country and it did that for the purpose of, enforcing that secularism. But don't you think that by enforcing a law that eradicates religious symbols, what you're doing essentially is not saying that we're secular, what you're saying is that we're not tolerant of differences. Because if people have to change to be accepted, then that's not any real tolerance. And as a result, you had all these riots from the Muslims and the Christians, mostly from Muslims. And I mean, I'm not, taking a side or anything, but I just feel that, if somebody is uncomfortable doing something for religious reasons, tolerance is actually accepting their discomfort in which they profess in doing something because of religion and accepting them as they are. And I feel that policy that France enacted was more of was more of a stimulant to further riots and more of a stimulant that would create further religious conflicts. And in fact, I think France used to be more secular and more tolerant before this policy, because after this you had reactionary groups rioting, because when your religion is, you react against it, you just, you reinforce and you retaliate more strongly, you become more defensive, and that's what happened. You had riots coming in, Muslims and Christians and everything. So my essential question is that, do you think that that policy was successful? Do you think that it actually had any benefits to society?
I think you're right. I mean, we are non-tolerant toward religion, in fact. And the issue at stake there is not so much a question of faith or freedom of worship. It's about communitarism. We have this unique model, which is not working so well these days, and we understand integration only as assimilation. You want to become French, you come to France, you have to abide by the old ways, and we are scared. I say we are scared. Yeah, this is a society that is scared of differences, that doesn't know very well how to manage them, that is not confident enough, I think, to accept differences, and so basically it's destabilized. What the scarf issue did was to destabilize the establishment, the rulers, the rule, the name of the game didn't fit, so they banned it, they banish it, but it doesn't solve anything. I think you're right, and it's more about us than it is about the Muslim minority in France, which is big, by the way. It's 10% of the population. It's huge, but again, it worked this way. It produced two things. This law, which again I think is not a good law because you don't solve these kind of issues with a law. And it produced also, for the first time, Muslim Council, National Council of Muslim, leadership probably. And so they for the first time they put those people together and they tried to be somebody the state could talk to, because as you know in France the state is omnipotent. Everybody is demonstrating in the street against the state because they want the state to do more, right? So we have this new body that can be very helpful in enhancing the dialogue, and again, I think it's about a tiny minority, because when you look at the figures about the religious practice among the Muslim population in France, it's as low as the practice in the Christian majority. I've seen the figure that 10% of the Muslims living in France practice their prayer 5 times a day.
Other questions, comments? Ron?
Yes, it's easy to criticize what the French have done in their schools, partly in the effort, among other things, to keep pressure off some women in their culture. I'm not saying it's an advisable process, but they do have a notion that there is a secular school system that educates you into French citizenship. It seems to me that one of the problems we're beginning to face, and David has signaled this a little bit in his 10 o'clock then and now comparison, is we're beginning to separate as a culture. We have now several million youngsters in evangelical Christian schools who are not learning anything about modern biology and whose views of history are shaped by many of the teachers in that culture. We have an increasing number of Jewish youngsters, as you pointed out, in day schools. We have a Catholic school system that has always been been present, but now with a new kind of Catholic devotionalism, it's getting a little bit more like the evangelical system around. So I'm wondering, and now I'll come to the question. The question is, it's easy to criticize France for its militant secularism and sometimes, exclusion of difference. But can it be said that the French are fighting for something that we're beginning to forget? That a democracy does have to have a common educational system and culture?
Well, I mean, may I?
Sure.
I'll take a shot at it.
No.
And then you can have a shot at it. I mean, obviously, I personally am concerned about that, or I wouldn't have, brought up the whole ton-of-fly thing. But I think that to a certain extent, we're captive of what I mentioned before, this absence of the conservative Christians from sort of the conversation for such a long period of time. And when people come roaring back into action again after being sidelined for so long, it becomes politically unfeasible in some ways, really, to put the cap on it and say, hey, look, it's all very well and good that you're back in the process again, but we can't let you homeschool. It's not the way the current administration tends in any case, but I think that even if you saw an administration that was not inclined in that direction, was inclined toward everybody going to the same schools, it would be tough. Perhaps it would be tough in a good cause. But to some extent, I hope that this is a tidal sort of thing. I think that I really think that and I mean, it's not as though evangelical Christians or conservative Christians were absent. They were part of the Southern vote, but they were not sort of consciously themselves in some ways. But it's sick for a political system, for a group that really has such strong opinions, not to sort of speak them out. And to a certain extent, it may be a pendulum swing. And I don't know how far the pendulum goes before it starts swinging back or before you find an equilibrium. But as you can tell from my talk, I'm a hoper for equilibrium.
If I may add something, I think it's more a matter of social cement. And I think it's strong enough here in the US, at this point at least, to confront that and this risk that you mentioned. Because the question you ask is, what does it take to make a country? What we are scared of is the minority of young immigrants from the second generation who were born in France and who hate France and reject the country where they live, while they have no ambition or even project to leave anyway. So what do you do when you find that it doesn't work with them to the point that they hate the system? And this is very scary. I used to cover the wars in Yugoslavia, and it was striking to see that after 70 years of existence of this country, the last census before the war in 91, only 18% of people would declare themselves as Yugoslavs. All the rest, they were Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, whatever. So if in 70 years you don't develop this sense of common citizenship, of belonging to the same nation, it means that it's very fragile, this link. I'm not saying that France has this kind of fear, but suddenly in the midst of our strong national identity, we are confronted to this problem, which is not religious. It's more, it's partly religious probably, but it's more identical and social, I think.
Ezra.
Sure. To the American side of the equation, could you comment, I guess, on the prevalence of how sort of American capitalism has sort of meshed with the evangelical movement and how the two work with a sort of symbiosity? And because that's how I see how the evangelicals have came back onto the political spectrum by aligning themselves with Wall Street and more main, I guess, traditional Republican interests. And I'm wondering if you see that alliance lasting much longer.
I do think that there's there's an overlap of constituency, but I'm not certain. But you also see strains between those two parts of the Republican base. I don't think I would, I mean, as long as it's successful electorally, I would imagine that that they'll be able to continue to work together. I'm not certain that I see evangelicalism as more as an easier fit with American style capitalism than some other groups. So I think my suspicion, and I must admit to not being a political correspondent and not writing that much about religion and politics, writing more about religion in other ways, but my suspicion would be as long as it produces majorities, that you'll see it, they'll hang together, and when it ceases to produce majorities, there'll be a natural falling apart.
Great. Tom?
Well, since you bring that up, I think maybe I'm being Pollyannish, but the current administration has actually been really cynically nasty to the people, to the religious right to office. I mean, to have a vice president who could tell the senator from Vermont on the floor of the Senate to go fuck himself did not go down real well with the right-wing religious people. And I think there's a sense growing among many of them that they've been used by this administration.
Well, they're constantly worried about being used. They felt used by the Reagan administration. They felt used by George Bush, the first George Bush. I mean, on the one hand, it's always the kingdom. You're trying to achieve the kingdom. You're never going to achieve, as the gentleman that I quoted said, you can't achieve the kingdom on earth, and therefore you're bound to the extent that you ally yourself with any political party to be disappointed and embittered. On the other hand, it does seem to me as though this administration has been more receptive to a lot of the goals of the religious right than, say, Bush's father was. And as regards Dick Cheney's profanity, it does go to show that there are at least two strains in the Republican Party, but I'm not certain they're all going to go marching off or sit on their hands in the next election because of that.
Well, my question is, does progressive evangelicalism have any chance of making any difference at all?
I think that it does, but probably not as much as non-evangelicals and as self-defined progressives would wish. I mean, again, the gist of what I was saying is we're stuck with this for a while because both parties want it. Both parties want something to fight over. Both parties want something to do direct mail campaigns about. So it works in a weird way. And I think that, I mean, I do think that when you see somebody like Warren saying, no, I just don't want to concentrate on this stuff. He's not known as when people think about Warren, they don't really call him an evangelical progressive. They call him an evangelical leader. When he says, no, I prefer to spend my time in Africa, I mean, I'm not certain, as regards what he's doing in Africa, that may or may not work out. But what it does send a message that, yes, it's okay to be a conservative Christian, but not a Christian conservative, or at least not to define yourself that way. So I would expect that there would be a further blooming of such definitions, but I'm not certain that in the near term that it would change the political situation much.
Yes.
I'm reading a book called End of Faith by Sam Harris. He's a Stanford philosopher. And his premise is that as long as we have these organized religions, there will never be peace. We're just going
faction believes that it has the right path, and everybody else, the true believer, believes is really going to rot in hell. As long as the religion says that it's okay to kill in the name of God, that there just won't be envy. We have to be more reasonable. We're believing things now. In 1492, we thought the world was flat. And here we're believing all these precepts from biblical times. And it's just not working out.
So the question is?
More of a
What do you
comment.
think of that premise?
Do you want to take it?
I agree. Yesterday night, I watched on TV Jerry Falwell giving preaching, and the theme was the myth of tolerance. And the other one, I was looking in my paper because I wrote it down. That's a blessing. I mean, I'm going here today, so I have to write it down, but I lost it, obviously. The other one was the myth of universal salvation. So essentially, I mean, truth is an absolute, and religion is about absolute truth. And I think when you travel around the world, you see so many wars justified in part or in total by faith and religion. It's amazing. And it's true today in Darfur. It was true in Yugoslavia, and even Ireland. I mean, this is you never heard the Pope speaking about Ireland? Strange.
A comment in the back. Oh, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I think I have to. I think I might differ a little bit from you on this. Well, first of all, I mean, it kind of depends on where you're coming from. If you are a person of faith, then God is a presence, and humanity has to respond, which may be in itself an invidious kind of notion, but it's not. The believer would say it's not really for us to decide whether or not God exists. God's there, and we have to figure out our responses. So I speak up on behalf of a constituency I don't represent to say that. As regards my own feelings, and this is why one of the reasons I wanted to be off the record here, because I don't speak for Time Magazine here. I think we're hardwired for it. I think not only do I think that we're hardwired for it, but I also think that that when we confront death or any of the lesser complaints of humanity that I say are lesser but are really quite horrible, that religion is an extraordinary solace and help, and to talk about it strictly in terms of the Crusades or strictly in terms of the Balkan War or something like that is to ignore that, and also to ignore, and I hate to say this, but the amount of good that it probably did on the ground in the Balkan War for believers who, despite the fact that they might have been fighting one another over religion, in the midst of the horror that was caused by that fighting, when somebody was dying in their family or died in their family, were only able to contextualize it or to deal with it through faith. So I think at the very least you have a much more complicated situation than just saying, well, it's a bad thing.
Sure. But we are dealing with two different levels. I mean, as a force in society, religion is one thing. Personal faith is a totally different matter. I mean, I respect.
But the problem is, it's very difficult to have the one without the other.
Yeah, but you have all sorts of levels of political influence transmitted to the church or the clerics or all this social apparatus that is supposed to keep the faith to expand it and to, you know, so it's one thing. I mean, I abide to the morals of Christianhood. I mean, I think it's good not to kill one another. It's a very good precept for living societies. But religion is also a political force, and there it's a different matter in my view.
Let me go to the back of the room. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask both of you what you thought about the changing perception of religion among students in higher education, because if any of these social changes are kind of going to stick, it's going to be driven by 20-somethings who are then going to, you know, take over the offices of power. And I know in America, and I'm sure also in Europe, this generation is kind of been transformed by 9/11 and this heightened awareness of injustices abroad and kind of the superpowers play in that. And, you know, Rick Warren spending time in Africa is very appealing. It's a very appealing image to students who are kind of moving away from the moral laxity of, you know, the previous generation, both, you know, economically and perhaps personally. So, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, how do you see students responding to the religious conservatism in America, but also the struggles between church and state in Europe?
Can I ask him how he sees them as responding?
Yeah.
How do you see them as responding?
I just personally, I have a lot of friends who are really interested in social justice and tying that with their faith. One of the biggest things that I've done at Dartmouth is be involved in the Christian community here, and I have very legalistic friends, and I also have very liberal, social justice-minded Christian friends in that community. And there's a real lively debate and a real kind of conscientious, it's our job to fix the problems in this world, whether it be from kind of the moral depravity that the hippie generation left us with, or the kind of economic dominance and greed that, like, neocolonialism has left us with. So that's how I see
Great
it.
question. I'm looking at the grimaces in the audience where you have most, you know, all the old hippies sitting here saying.
I think it's a whole ball of questions, actually. I'm not certain that everybody reacts to 9/11 in the same way. I think that, for instance, there is a reaction to 9/11 which would be, well, look where religion has got us. The political response in some ways. And even in terms of responding to 9/11 from a faith perspective, I think that you might find within the Christian community some people who saw in it signs and wonders, or the prophecy being fulfilled, and might see it in a essentially as an end times opening act, which causes you to act one way, and other people who see it like the new monastics see it, which I assume is kind of where you're coming from, which is sort of an Anabaptist social justice approach. The one thing that came through very, very clearly in your question is something that I still wish I had, which is the desire of youth to make things good and to solve the problems that previous generations have left behind. And I can only say, as somebody who is a tail end of the hippie generation myself, that they didn't think of themselves really as creating a situation of moral depravity, but also thought that they were going to make the world better.
Philippe, do you want to add to that, or?
No, it's just, yeah, I agree. I think in every generation you have people attracted to by this inspiration and wanting to. What you said didn't surprise me. I think I've heard that every time I go to talk to students, and I have daughters your age, and among their friends and so on. What surprised me is that the link you made with 9/11, like a spiritual awakening. What's the link between 9/11 and religion, in your view?
For me personally, it's a pretty big link, but I don't know if you can make that as kind of a social comment. I do think that there was definitely a moral awakening, and some people have used religion.
When you say it's a big link, it's because for you it's obvious that the motivation of the terrorists were religious motivations, right?
Oh no.
That's what you mean?
No. I guess when I was sort of like discovering faith for the first time, it was about the time of 9/11. That was my first day of high school, and like that year I became a Christian, and so like I don't know, I see a tie in kind of the desire for social justice, which I think is driving a lot of my friends to define their faith in more solid terms. I guess I definitely see like where religion has brought us, and I think your conversation about the personal faith versus religion is very relevant, talking about 9/11 and the solace that it brings, but also the conflict.
Great. Other questions or comments? Yes.
David, you mentioned that there are a number of Southern Baptists that signed a paper or encouraged more participation in public schools.
Well, there's a movement in the Southern Baptist Convention to move kids out, and it was defeated at the last convention. And what we're seeing now is the sort of a preemptive strike by those who want to keep the kids in the public schools in anticipation of the next Southern Baptist Convention in June.
Okay, a lot of internal politics within the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm the age that did some minor voter registration work in the early '60s. In the South. Then, after the segregated schools were legally abolished, huge numbers of white academies were created. I haven't followed this recently, but I'm wondering to what extent those white academies still exist, or has there been a movement toward more private religious schools, which may or may not be racially segregated?
There's been a movement, well, for one thing, I can't really give you a definitive answer because it's not something I've written on or studied that closely, but what I am aware of is that the big movement that has made headlines in the last 10 years has been homeschooling. It's not academies, it's your parents sometimes using materials that are provided by a parachurch group in addition to usual reading, writing, arithmetic stuff we'll teach you at home, which strikes me as having sort of less of a segregationist taste to it than what you were describing.
You don't know how much the former white academies are still very active in these.
That's something I would like to know, but I don't.
Okay.
Next panel. In the front row.
I'd like to ask you a question regarding the evangelicals being recruited, in my view, by the Republicans and not the other way around. I think that there is a structural reason for that within the political system in this country, and that is that we don't have a proportional system of representation. So by swaying a small fraction of the population, we win elections. And that's why you throw bombs like burning flags, like abortion, like any number of things to the Christians, so they vote on their side.
Wow. Proportional system of representation. Well, they're not that small a group. I do think that, and I also think that, notwithstanding the question of proportional voting versus the Electoral College. I would say that the system rewards activists, and that if you can get people excited enough, then what you do is you energize activists who then energize the people around them. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not certain I would put it in exactly those terms.
On the question of abortions, for example, 75% or so of the population is in favor of keeping things the way they are. But the Christians are much more represented in terms of their opinion on the question when it comes to voting. A lot more politicians will support the anti-abortion vote because they know that a small wedge of the pie will come their way if they do that.
Well, I mean, again, this is to a certain extent I feel very bad because some of this stuff is more political than I tend usually to get. But I'm here; it's a political discussion, so I'm going to do what I can. I think that if you look at the polling numbers, my impression is that that they become more complicated when the question becomes should abortions be harder to get, and that you actually do have a real discussion that goes on at that level, and that when the Supreme Court ruled, it created a politically difficult situation, which we are now trying to work out. I wouldn't want to downplay the cynicism of any political party, but I think that there are also real concerns at work as well. I don't think that we're totally in a situation where the tail is wagging the dog.
How many politicians do you know have nuanced their position on abortion?
What, nuanced their?
Nuanced, saying I'm for abortion, but I would agree to parental notification, etc., etc. They never say that. They say I'm against it or I'm for it.
I see Hillary Clinton moving around, I think, but I mean, somebody would have to back me up on that. I think that the notion of making abortion legal but difficult has gained some traction.
The very back row.
Yes. To what extent do you think the Christian right movement is going to revert either both religiously and politically once James Dobson retires, or at this point dies?
I lost the last sentence.
To what extent do you think the Christian right is going to be affected both politically and just religiously once James Dobson retires?
James Dobson retires. I think that he is a very effective operative, but I don't. He's not the only game in town. I think that he. I've heard some people in Washington say that he overstates his own power, and these are evangelical Christian political types. So I don't think that when he goes, the whole cause goes down with him. Whether anybody will be effective in precisely the way that he's effective, I'm not sure. And Anya and I were just talking last night about that he seems to be having an impact on sort of his original area of expertise, which is child upbringing. At this point, he's become part of the mainstream debate. That was what got him into the political discussion. It was on the generation of people were raised according to James Dobson, who to some extent listened to him on politics, although originally his original authority came from somewhere else. So I don't know. I don't think. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think the religious right will survive his retirement.
I won't even go to I'm assuming James Dobson has not made it to France, so you maybe don't want to.
Well, everybody knows him in France, but I.
No. Okay.
What surprises me is, I mean, this gentleman for me is a political activist. He is a very poor theologian. Yeah. Very poor. I mean, you listen to him. It's a basic moral lessons you can get. And I see him as a politician, nothing else, almost nothing else. I mean, he uses religion as his main tool in order to achieve political goals. And okay.
Yes,
not a
in the middle.
specialist.
Do you think that 9/11 might have been like the first salvo in a great religious war, and that's what we're in right now?
Well, if we keep on saying that, it might very well end up being the case. Because almost everybody is, even those who don't say it, who pretend not to say it, like President Bush, he always says, oh, this wonderful religion of Islam that has been perverted by a small minority. But that's exactly the way to point your finger to Islam, right? The same with the global war on terror. Who is the enemy? Terror? The other day, I had this conversation with Bernard Lewis, who said, it's like if we had said during the Second World War that we were at war with submarines and aircrafts. Terror is not an enemy, it's not a cause, it's a tactic. And the same with the role of Islam in terror. I'm not saying that there is none, but the people who have studied that, like Mark Sageman, Understanding Terrorist Networks, he was a CIA operative, and he is now a forensic psychiatrist specialized in mass murderers and terrorists and so on. And he has written a book studying the case of 172 jihadists. 17% had received religious education as kids in madrasas. 17% of them. The vast majority ended up being committing suicide attacks and so on out of frustration, social frustration. They were educated people. They usually knew the West. They had been in the West. They had been in some way rejected or thought that they didn't have found their place in that world. I mean, it's a much more complex picture, I think.
We have just enough time for a couple more questions in the middle.
Going back a little bit to your previous comments.
Do you have a little bit louder?
It was interesting to hear your comments about personal faith as opposed to your comments about religion in society. It seemed to me almost to reflect the more traditional American experience with Protestantism and personal faith versus the continental experience with historically the extraordinary influence that the Catholic Church has seen. So, I guess in view of the current, or the apparent current trend towards a greater almost factionalization in terms of education, in terms of educating the kids within the religion, or the trend, as it were, that we might see towards increased institutionalization in America of the religions, even in view of your comments about the strength of multiplicity in maintaining the balance and the equilibrium in the American system. The problem that might arise in the greater institutionalization of these factions, as opposed to what has previously been sort of, I guess, your descriptions of the Eisenhower era, where it was much more personal. And so, whether you think either of you think it might be possible to maintain that sort of balance in view of a greater institutionalization of of many smaller religious groups.
Well, another thing that happened, and I'm not certain exactly what the date was, but the Immigration Act allowed a lot more people from a much wider variety of countries into the United States, and that includes Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists. And I'm not certain that, I don't think we could have gone on indefinitely along the lines that I was suggesting. I think that it was to some extent, not necessarily an accident of history, but it was part of history, and one way or another we were going to move beyond it. I'm not I don't know whether the sort of particularistic impulse at this point is going to go so far that it's going to make it difficult for us to govern ourselves, but I'm not suggesting that we're there yet. And to some extent, I think it will be welcome to some of the religions that are just now beginning to find their feet here. As part of a religion, one of the many religions that has had difficulty finding its feet here from time to time, and been seen as running counter to whatever the American faith was. Seems possible to me that at least a Hindu coming into the United States would have a better time of it now. That strikes me as maybe a good thing.
One last question. Yes.
Modern liberal societies, I guess at least on theoretical grounds, have this commitment to achieving a sense of pluralism and tolerance. But within these tolerant and pluralistic societies, we wind up finding these religious minorities that I guess rely on isolating themselves from that society for their existence. So you find the Lubavitch Jews, the Amish communities, the evangelical Christians, who believe that they need to educate their children outside of this pluralistic community in order for their religion to continue to exist. I guess the French model, they justify more communitarian policies in order to achieve this political goal of unity and trying to get everyone along the same lines to work towards political goals. But do you think that liberal societies that are actually committed to pluralism and tolerance can normatively justify enacting policies that could arguably not allow some religions, even if they are intolerant, to exist?
Wow.
Great question.
Yes. Well, I don't think any society should forbid any religion. The role, I mean, the common decision of a society should be to designate the space where you can worship as you like, and the space where you should play by common rules. That's how I see it. But it's no question of forbidding anything. I mean, of course, you probably have in mind the scarf issue. But again, it's not forbidden to wear it. It's forbidden to do a few certain things with it. You cannot go to the Republican secular school with it, but you can do everything else. So again, you're not, I mean, those girls, as soon as they go out of school, they put it on. And as somebody mentioned earlier, one of the motivations of this law was also to alleviate the pressure that those young girls may have in their families, and very, very limited free decision in this. So at least there is a space where they belong to a larger group than their own family.
And I think that we have perhaps a different problem, and in some ways a bigger problem than the French do, in that the state is not as powerful in the United States as it is there, and because it's not as powerful, well, for better or for worse, and because it's not as powerful to tell somebody that they couldn't wear a big cross to a public school would create a big brouhaha. So yeah, I mean, the cultures come to it with a different hand of cards to play, and it's complex figuring out how to play that hand, and you can go wrong in a lot of different ways.
I should add that the state is our real religion. I'm not kidding. I mean, it has imposed itself historically by taking over a lot of duties that were the duties of the church, like helping the poor and the ones in a difficult situation. And so that explains a lot about many things that you shouldn't do.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank everyone for coming this afternoon, and especially for our guest speakers. And on behalf of all of the centers associated with the Centers Forum, we'd really like to thank our speakers this afternoon.